Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to another episode of Rednecks Rising, the podcast that'll have you hooting and hollering as we bust the myths surrounding Appalachians and our history. One ADHD-fueled deep dive and interview at a time. I'm your host, Chelsea, rooted in the Great Smoky Mountains of Western North Carolina, and I started this show out of a passion for evidence-based, healing-informed community organizing, a deep love for the Appalachian folks that raised me, and a righteous anger against structures that prioritize their profit at our expense. On that note, if you didn't listen to the bonus episode that aired last week with Grace from Power, please go give it a listen because it's about a very important issue and threat facing Appalachians who are already suffering at the hands of the climate crisis and are now being put at risk for yet again being deemed a sacrifice zone to appease the insatiable hunger of the profit machine. The Mountain Valley Pipeline. If you haven't heard of it, I'm serious. Please go listen to the episode. If you're not subscribed to Power's newsletter yet, please click on the link in the show notes for that episode and subscribe. Because they have a critical direct action coming up in early September, and there are a lot of ways that you can support their work that they share in their newsletter. Now, that was a bonus episode, but typically speaking, I switch between covering historical topics one week to sitting down for a chat with somebody the next week and going back and forth just between those two styles. And in my interviews, I talk to all kinds of different folks who have powerful stories to share, wisdom to enlighten us with, who are doing the work on the ground to build deep community networks of mutual aid and collective power, who are engaging in direct action on the front lines against the climate crisis, against white supremacist capitalism, and so much more just phenomenal work happening across our region. I'm super excited for you to join me for today's conversation with our friend TJ from Appalachian Firesides podcast. And he has just celebrated his 1 year anniversary of the podcast being live. Big shout out to TJ and congratulations, my friend. I have learned a lot from your content and you feature some fantastic voices. So y'all go follow Appalachian Firesides on social media, give their show a listen. You can find the links to that and in today's show notes as well. So TJ is based out of Kentucky and is gearing up for law school. We have a fun little conversation that involves digging into the art of storytelling and how it's integral to our region, along with the shared goal of our podcast to amplify the various stories and voices of our region. And we talk about the start of our podcasting ventures as well. We dunk on the crappy generalizations portraying Appalachia as a monolithic region. We touch on spiritual grounding and guidance under late-stage capitalism, political identities under the two-party for-profit electoral system, and of course, so much more. You may notice a couple of spots in the audio where things get a little fuzzy, so this is a disclaimer and a heads up, as well as a friendly reminder that we do in fact still live in Appalachia and that inequitable broadband access is very much so a thing that we experience out here. But before we break out the shovel and dig into that stellar conversation with our Kentuckian neighbor, let's take care of some quick, important points of order, shall we? Dun, da, da, da. We are officially 12 episodes into a podcast that was a dream and a passion project of mine, and that I could not do without you. This is an independently produced podcast. I don't have any fancy schmancy studio equipment or technical skills. I have like a pretty solid mic and a pair of hand-me-down headphones. And let me just tell you that thanks to the help of a few friends, I have a pretty great digital setup. And this project, this passion project, has been so much fun already in the few short weeks that we have been live and rolling, and the outpouring of support has been immense. It's also not at all an exaggeration when I say that this show would literally not be possible without y'all's support out there. For y'all listening out there to the pod, thanks to your streams and downloads, we've already surpassed over 2,000 listens, which is insane for a podcast that's just over 2 months old. For the folks who have been subscribing to the pod on your streaming services and leaving us ratings and reviews. Thanks to y'all, we have been consistently floating in the top 200 under the philosophy category on Apple charts since the launch. And for the folks who have been following on social media and sharing with your friends, y'all have been making it possible for these numbers to keep growing and maintaining. And we've also hit more than 1,000 followers on Instagram. And I know that maybe these numbers don't sound like a lot, but it's happened really quick and it feels like a lot to me. And so I'm just really, really grateful. And for the folks over on the Ko-Fi page, y'all are just so awesome. You've made it possible to help me pay for the costs that come along with publishing this podcast in a way that's actually like worth listening to. And you've also already helped us send more than $100 to our friends at the Pulaski County Free Store, which is just one of the many groups of folks on the ground that we intend to share the proceeds with when it comes to all the money coming in from our supporters, from the monthly supporters to the merch to the one-time donations and all the fun ways that folks can contribute over on our Ko-Fi page. And if you haven't checked out that page yet, that is spelled KO like knockout -fi.com/Rednecks Rising, just like the name of the podcast, but no spaces, no special characters, nothing like that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, y'all, for your support. And before I forget, actually, to mention, there's another way that folks have been supporting the show, which is by connecting me with awesome folks that I can host on the pod. And so far, y'all have been the ones who have helped me bring on amazing guests like Clover Lynn, aka Hillbilly Gothic. You also recommended Grace from the bonus episode with Power from last week. And there's so many more. And I could use, specifically in this moment, y'all support again with that, connecting me with more folks to feature on the show. If you know somebody with something to share, a story, important information, a call to action, whatever it is that you want to hear about or hear from, reach out to me on social media or email us at rednecksrising@gmail.com. And I think I've been talking at y'all for enough at this point. So with that said, I think it's about time we get to our trivia question of the day.
Hey, Chelsea.
Howdy, Chris.
So you've been talking a lot about coal mining the past few weeks. So I figured I'd ask you a crazy trivia question about coal mining.
Ooh, I'm excited to hear this one. What you got for us?
What is the distance that a coal mining company can legally mine from your home?
Like the closest that they can get to your house with their mining?
Yeah, the closest distance that they can legally mine from your home.
Interesting. If I had to take a guess, I would guess like 5 miles. But I guess if we want to find out, then if you're as curious as I am for the answer, don't forget to hang out with us till the end and we can find out together. I know we know each other on the internet, but like, who are you? I know just a little bit about you're trying to go to law school and like you host a podcast, but just like, who are you as a person?
Sure. As you said, I'm a philosophy major, so anytime anyone asks me these questions about who I am, I always take it way too far into
Let's go meta. Yeah, it's fine. Right, Let's do it.
But no, just starting out with my roots. I'm born and raised in Harlan County, Kentucky. That's my connection to Appalachia, the geographic connection, but my family has been here. I think my dad is really into this, looking back into how long our family has been here, and I think a good while. We've been here longer than I anticipated. Like when I was growing up, when we finally figured it out, I was surprised at how long my family has been in this region. But suffice it to say, it's been a long time. But I'm just a college kid. I'm going into my senior year of college, and as you said, planning to go to law school and come back here to work as a public defender. That's the goal right now. I'm the professional. Apart in terms of what I want to do, maybe apart from being a public defender, I'd really like to go into labor law, representing labor unions, especially those who have been really, and I say those who have been kind of like weakened the most by this just war on unionization that's been going on over the past 10 years. But really, that's all unions just about. But I'd really like to do something in that respect of representing people, whether in their fights to unionize or stay unionized or whatever. Those are just a couple of the goals that I have in terms of professional career. But I mean, as a person, and this, relates to my own podcast, Appalachian Firesides, I just want to help let folks tell their own stories. It's common, as I'm sure you know, and I'm sure that almost everyone else listening to this knows, when Appalachians are talked about, it's very rare that anyone ever asks us directly, like, what our take on something is. We're often told who we are and what we're like and what we're supposed to do and things like that. And I just got so sick of that, especially after reading certain books by certain authors who may or may not be seeking political office right now. That I was just tired of it. And I thought, I want to do something to help folks tell their own stories. People that I know, people that have grown up here in other parts of Appalachia, who care about it, who want to see it bettered, who really care about making a difference. That's my general life goal, is just making a difference. And the podcast is one way that I hope to do that. I didn't realize how easy it was to start a podcast. I just started listening to them regularly last year. And so I thought, could I try this? And here we are a year later. I never thought it would be get as far as it has, but here we are. So that's my goal as far as the podcast goes. I just want to help folks tell their stories. We talk about politics, history, current events, culture, any and everything that helps individuals just tell their stories about being here and working here and trying to make it better.
I love that. And I'm like, my ADHD is already kicking in because I have so many thoughts. So I interviewed earlier this week, Appalachian from Virginia, who is also is in law school right now, who lives in the Maryland, DC area going to law school and is planning on moving back also to be a public defender. So there's just I have so many questions because of that conversation and the things that we touched on. But then also I'm specifically with the labor stuff. I have my own experience with being fired for unionizing while I was working for a social justice organization. So I'm there's so many directions this conversation could already go. And I'm just so glad to have you on the show and that our paths crossed, because I feel our general goal is very similar too, which is just that I love telling stories. I love learning, and I love listening to other people talk and tell their own stories. And so that was a lot of the reason that I started this podcast too. But the difference is that so I've been listening to podcasts, and so I graduated undergrad in 2016, and I did a internship that year, and I had to drive to Asheville to do my internship placement. And so that's when I started listening to podcasts, was because of the drive. And I felt really intimidated by it and didn't know how I would ever get started. And I know some things kind of fell out at the beginning, but originally, I don't think if I had met Heather, who was originally supposed to partner with me on this, that I would have even had the kickstart to do the thing. Cause this had been a dream I had been thinking about for so long. So I love that you were I could do this, and just went for it. That's so great. But so where are you going to college right now?
Georgetown College in Kentucky. Usually I just stop, I just say, I go to Georgetown, and, let people make of that what they will, whether it's, if they think I'm going to Georgetown University, who am I to correct them?
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. No, I go to Georgetown College in Kentucky.
Okay, cool. So how far is that from where you originally lived?
Exactly 3 hours.
All right. Is that the closest college to home?
It's a bit of trek. Yeah. No, it's, not so much that, but out of all of the colleges that I applied to, that was the one that good opportunities for scholarships and different programs. I just in this past October to December got to go to Oxford University and studied there as a visiting student, and that was through the honors program at Georgetown. And we've got a great pre-law program there. So there were some places I could have gone that would have made the going back and forth a bit easier. But that was the place that fit me the best. And I've met a lot of great people there also from Appalachia who are just as invested in making a better future here. And so that's another reason that I'm thankful to be there. So the distance is a bit of a downer at times, but I've been able to make it work. And I think it was the right choice for me.
Yeah. Oh, good. I love that you've just feel like that's really met your needs and that you've had a lot of great opportunities there. Can I ask, so what is it that led to you feeling like you had this sort of like general life intention to like share other people's stories? Like, what is it that gave you that drive?
Sure. Well, I was thinking about this the other day. Such an integral part of Appalachia is the art of storytelling, and it really is an art form. In one of my episodes, I can't remember when, but in one of my episodes, I spoke to the head of that. That's one thing I talk about is that this whole job of storytelling is really integral to the region itself, and so that's one connection to it. But as far as me personally, it's so. I really started when I did read Hillbilly Elegy. In I think it was the summer in between my senior year of high school and freshman year of college. I was already I made a bit of a political transition from middle school through high school and certainly in and out, which I think is normal. Most people during that period of time, you change your viewpoints on certain things. But at that time, I was already pretty left leaning in my politics, and I had heard a lot about the book and especially heard more about it during the 2016 election. But I wasn't as avid of a reader then as I am now. And so I had that opportunity to read the book in that summer. And I heard from a good friend of mine who also has I heard from people who had similar politics as me say, oh yeah, I really like that book. And then I'd heard that it had generated some controversy too. So I thought, why not go ahead and read it and just see what it has to say. And I'll just put it this way. When I listed all of the books that I've read on the Goodreads social media platform and rated all of the books, the only reason that I gave Hillbilly Elegy 1 star is that it wouldn't let me give it 0 stars. It just was... there's so many things that I personally have like issues with the book, but the general issue that I have is that the way that Appalachians are portrayed is very generalization doesn't really do justice to how monolithic Appalachia is portrayed as in that book. But it's portrayed as being a place where there's only one type of person who lives there, and you can either be someone who is a striver or you can just not. And that's the way that I perceived Appalachia was portrayed in that book. And I remember feeling so angry because I knew from living here that this place is a lot more complicated and diverse than it's being made out to be in this book, as I understood it. And, there are people here who completely disprove a lot of the claims about Appalachia that are made in that book. And so that's what really got me thinking, man, I want to do something to help us tell our own stories. And it took me a few years to figure out, what that was. I thought about, this is really funny. During when COVID first started, I thought, I had a lot of free time on my hands after the semester ended and it was all online. So I thought, what if I tried to self-publish an online newsletter? But then that was way too complicated. And so I was going to be somebody like from the French Revolution that they published all their own newspapers and everything, but that was way too complicated for me. But then, as I went, over the years, came to think, well, maybe I finally settled on, maybe podcasting. Let's try that. And so I just, it kind of took me a little bit to figure out the structure of episodes and the kind of episodes I wanted to do and when I wanted to publish and things like that. But I've kind of settled on a pattern now. And, whenever I have a chance, I just want to have folks on. We've talked about, I had a friend from college. She lives in a county over from me, literally over a mountain, and there they are. But they and I talked about advocating for our region. I talked about, as I said, the scholars who have studied Appalachia. I I've talked to some of my friends who grew up here, about their own experiences. And really, that's just been the whole goal. And it really just stems from a desire to let people tell their own stories and not just say else speak doesn't present all of who we are. And that's something else that I realize is that, I pretty evident when you listen to my podcast what my politics are and where I stand on things. And in a lot of instances, I'm some folks who listen to it who don't agree with everything I say, and that's something that I'm actually thankful for, is that we're able to have a diversity of opinion where we can agree on some things and disagree on others. And I realize that not everybody in Appalachia thinks like me. The last thing that I want to do is portray it as monolith the other way. Like, everybody in Appalachia doesn't look like JD Vance, but they look like me and they think like me. That's not at all what I'm trying to do. So it is a journey. It's a process. I mean, it's a learning process, and building and growing and trying to find a way that I can help people tell their stories and tell them authentically, but also for folks who aren't from Appalachia. Like, I've got the publishing platform I use. I can kind of see geographically where folks are located. And I've made reference to this person on my podcast before, but I have one listener in the Yukon in Canada. And so I'm thinking, okay, that person may never see what Appalachia is like, may never meet somebody from Appalachia. How can I show them what it's like through podcasting? And so, I try to, make it clear that not everybody here looks like me, thinks like me, is exactly like me. We do have diversity here. We have different viewpoints on a lot of different things, but that's the point, that we are a richly diverse and complicated and beautiful region. And so, storytelling as an art form and as a duty being so important to Appalachia itself, I just want to try to emulate that and use it for a good purpose.
So much of what you're saying just resonates so strongly with me. I think what you were saying about like not wanting to also to just counter the stereotypes and the like monolithic generalizations with another version of a monolithic like generalization. Right. And that's why I think like part of this podcast, I really wanted to do the historical intentional stuff where it was like, no, I really want to uncover this like whitewashed history that's been completely removed. Like, I didn't learn a lot of the stuff I'm learning for the first time, but then I also was like, how can I do this in a way that's like, my voice isn't the only one that folks are hearing. And that's why I was like, I really wanted to do that like interview, like in between, so that there were other voices. And I'm trying to be intentional about featuring voices of folks that aren't the people who typically have access to platforms that let them have their stories told. So we hear from politicians a lot, right? Like, we hear from like people in positions of power, whatever that may be, if they're like big authors who, even, I think of like Elizabeth Katz, awesome, right? But she has platforms already. She like has an access to this. And so intentionally trying to reach out to Appalachians that like don't get that opportunity to tell their story, because there is so much diversity, and like, it makes me so mad. I get into leftist. I was on leftist TikTok earlier today, and like when folks, it's at least one or two folks will come onto a video that I've made just to slam on Appalachia and be like, I can't believe that you even have one person was like, wow, you've really let yourself become convinced that those people aren't totally reactionary. And I'm just like, who are those people? Like, which version of Appalachia are you referring to? Like, what do you mean? And so what I also want to back up a little bit too, when you were talking about how you made your like political transition. And because I think a lot of folks think that Appalachia is politically monolithic, and it is totally normal for a lot of us to discover a lot of our own true values and how we see the world in that period of time. But like, was there anything in particular that contributed to your like changing in your own political perspective over those years?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So growing up, I consider myself somebody who is still to this day religious, and I grew up in a religious community, not just a religious household, but the people around us. And there was always this meshing of politics and religion that has gotten more overt over the years in a lot of churches and around me, and I'm sure that's true throughout Appalachia and throughout the country. It's not just here, but there was always this implicit expectation that of the community in general, not like in my household. I'm thankful that my parents are people who never discouraged me from changing my views. And what I mean by that is the views that I have right now. They know that I'm politically very, very pretty progressive, and they have come to agree with me on a lot of things. We all I remember in the 2020 primaries, Kentucky's was held really, really late in the Democratic primaries, and I had ordered some yard signs for from Bernie Sanders' campaign. I'd only ordered about 3, and I ordered them just before the pandemic happened, and so they were a few months late, and they didn't get to the mail and get through me in the post until after Bernie had dropped out of the primaries. And so I told my dad, I'm just going to hang them up anyway. I mean, why not? And he helped me do it. And he told me, he said, when we got done hanging them up, he said, well, if nobody else in Harlan votes for Bernie, he's got 3 votes, meaning he and me and my mother. And so I'm really thankful that they have been willing to listen to me when we talk about these issues, and they've come to agree with me on a lot of different things. And they never had an expectation for how I would believe politically. They very much encouraged me to think for myself and to come to my own conclusions that made sense to me. And because I was brought up to believe that way, I started to kind of push back against this grain a little bit of the expectation that a lot of people had, that, okay, well, if you call yourself a Christian, which I would, and still to this day, then you have to be a Republican. You have to be a conservative. And that really, like, something about that never sat right with me, but I didn't figure out what until 2016, with the rise of Trump and his politics. I remember thinking to myself, how in the world can a party which claims to be the party of family values and the value of hard work and pro veteran nominate somebody who is antithetical to all of those things? And apart from his blatant misogyny, sexism, racism, homophobia, every bad thing about his character that was attributed in his behavior, it really was that breaking point of no, he doesn't represent me, and so I'm going to figure out something else that works for me. And so consequently, I started reading a bit more on political history in the United States and political theory. I came to be, and still am, a great admirer of FDR and the New Deal. The name Appalachian Firesides is an homage to FDR and the Fireside Chats. Certainly a lot of things about his presidency that were wrong and problematic, and I'm working on an episode right now where I address that. But of the whole, on the economic side, I remembered hearing stories from my grandparents about how, and my about how those programs helped my great grandparents during the Depression, and how the Great Society helped my grandparents when they were growing up. And so all of these threads kind of came together for me to say, you know what, I believe in a way of ordering society that takes care of people's needs, material needs, political rights, civil rights. And, it's been a journey from that point. And, there are things that I thought, even that when I first started to describe myself as, I don't even know what I would have called myself back when I just would have said in 2016, I would have voted for Bernie. And, that's still a big part of my politics, but it's beyond just the person of Bernie Sanders. As much as I admire him, it's something deeper than that. It's a concern for the needs of working people. And that's only been compounded as I've read more about my own community's history as just a really crucial part of the labor movement in Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia, and in these issues that are affecting us now. It's all kind of been, from that point, a desire to form a politics of helping to meet people's material needs, especially working people. And so kind of a convoluted kind of to change politically, but that's about where I am right now.
No, I thank you so much for explaining, just touching on the whole nuance that goes into forming a human being's perspective on the world and how they engage with politics and relate to it and see their role in it and how they understand it, because there is so much that goes into that. And like, I also have been on a journey myself, and I'm still a very spiritual person, but don't identify as a Christian necessarily anymore. Although I have close friends who are
Sure.
even pastors who, like, I look to them when I'm like, I'm looking for spiritual guidance, and they understand my politics, you know, and like, and so, but like, there was a point where the reason I stepped away from the church was because exactly what you were naming was that, like, the rhetoric that was being used about current events did not line up with what I felt like was being talked about in like the historic events in the Bible. Right. And like, I'm like, wait a second, like, this isn't exactly the Jesus that like we're reading about. Like, I don't think that this is how this would sit. But also, I think, like, in my life growing up, there was this weird, like, almost a perception of conservatism, but everyone was registered as a Democrat because of like the historical ownership that the Democrats had had over like the primary elections. So like, even like my Trump voting relatives would be like registered Democrats voting for Trump because of like this very weird like nuance to things. And over the years, I kind of had a journey where I like started in like, as I even got into politics at first, I was like very heavily into the Democratic Party and bought into that. And at this point, I'm like way far left anything in the establishment. But it's like, I also don't necessarily, the nuance is that like, I don't know enough about theory to claim any kind of like ideological label, but exactly what you described, it's like, working class people, working people, poor people in general are getting fucked. There's enough to go around. We have an abundance of resources, and we know what it's like for communities to self-sustain and self-govern those resources in a way that is actually effective. And like, we've got this whole machine is like, so it's working exactly as it's intended. So I can't see that it's broken, but it's hurting so many of us that it's got to go. Like, so I just appreciate you naming that.
Yeah, of course. And just to, put it out there, I'm right there with you. I have, I was thinking about this the other day and, trying to determine how I would describe myself in terms of the political dialogue that we use: Democrat, Republican, left, right, center, moderate, liberal, whatever. And that really politically, I consider myself an independent. I'm still registered as a Democrat, just for the fact that the way that the system is constructed is so hostile towards anybody who isn't registered as a Democrat or a Republican, whether you're in a deep red state, deep blue state, swing state, whatever. It really is disempowering to people who are registered as anything else. And so for the moment, I have decided to kind of stick it out and, just, in the event that there's a primary and I can, make a voice in it and throw my vote towards a candidate that I think would do a great job, I'll stay registered as a Democrat. But for all intents and purposes, I consider myself independent. And it's like you said, the scenery of the leadership of the National Democratic Party. And this is weird too, because I've heard it. I've heard a lot of folks explain different things the way I'm explaining this now. Like, I've heard folks say the National Democrats don't represent me, and they'll say that because they're registered as a Democrat but are pretty conservative, which I get. But the National Democrats don't represent me either, because I'm, the way that I think is so antithetical to how they're doing things as well. So I just wanted to say that I'm right there with you. I am just done with the duopoly of Democrats and Republicans. I've toyed with the idea of trying to start a Harlan party or going in and, seeing what happens. But politically, I would consider myself more of an independent. So done with the parties.
Totally. Yeah. And I say that as someone who worked for them at one point as a community organizer. So, it's like, I feel like I'm probably going to say over the course of this podcast, like a lot of things that piss some people off, but everything that I say is coming from a place of like lived experience and like learning from those experiences, like working for the Democratic Party, where I really feel like they intentionally in 2016 handed over those rural communities because they knew that they were going to benefit from a Trump presidency just as much as the Republican Party was going to benefit from it. So it's just like so much backwardsness and like collaborating and conspiring, and it's not set up for the working folks. So this thread continues then now because like you're like, oh, working class folks are at the center of my politics, and you're wanting to go on to be like a labor lawyer potentially.
Absolutely. And it's one of those, I didn't decide on law school until year of, and I'm thinking about being been at the top of my list and still is for now, and I'll definitely do some kind of work related to that field eventually. But I've also thought about different ways that I can serve the needs of working people, and that seems to me working in that field to be a pretty a good opportunity to make some headway in there, because as we were saying, there's just been a complete and total war on unionization since Reagan's presidency, especially. When you look at the figures, I think only about 10 or 11% of the workforce is unionized right now. I'm really thankful to see a picking up of that. I shared a graphic on the podcast page from Perfect Union that requests for union petitions or something requests for a union petition to vote to the National Labor Relations Board are up 56% since last year. Starbucks and Amazon, a bunch of different places of employment are kind of leading that charge. I'm really thankful for the folks in that field doing that work, because it is so important. And the legislative side of it has just helped that. You've got disastrous like right to work laws like here in Kentucky that are just
North Carolina too.
Just god awful, and they're designed to break the unions in a way that is just so, when the history behind the struggle for unionization and the struggle for working class rights in general, it's so it's so evident that they're just trying to, that the big corporations, the malefactors of great wealth, as Teddy Roosevelt would call them, are specifically trying to break the power of working people to band together and organize and collectively bargain. And that's something that I really want to push against, not just from my community's history of labor struggle, but from a practical standpoint, in that when we have a system like we have now, where both parties have failed us and both parties have failed working people in such demonstrable ways, then really we're the ones who have to stand up for ourselves and have to empower ourselves and have to exercise that power in a way that is pragmatic and can, effectively and immediately better our material conditions. And unionization is one of, if not the most apparent and ready way that we can do that. And so with how difficult it's become to unionize with right to work laws, with blatant union busting tactics like from Starbucks, and I think it was Chipotle closed their first unionized store. I think I saw that in I saw that recently, that the first unionized store of some kind of fast food chain, I believe, some kind of restaurant chain, just up and closed that restaurant. I'm sure that had nothing to do with the fact that it was the first unionized store. But with the onslaught against the rights of workers and the rights to unionize, that's one way that I think I can be of service. And it's something that I'm still learning about what the best way to do that would be, whether it would be for me to come back here or whether it would be to go somewhere where there's already a more established union presence. I'm still kind of working all that out, but it's definitely something that I want to look into as a way of just helping working people build power for themselves.
Yeah, I'll be so interested to follow along in your journey as you figure out this stuff, because I think the way that the legal system has also been set up to kind of silo and complicate employment law in particular is like very like half the time you don't even go through the legal system that you would go through for small claims or criminal charges. It's like you literally go through the National Labor Relations Board, right? Like a whole separate entity.
Right.
The processes are different. And so like, I'll just be so interested to hear like kind of how you both navigate like law school and the process of figuring that out, but then also what happens and like where the state of affairs is by the time that you finish law school, right? Like things could be just given the rate of increase, like the exponential growth in unionization and union efforts over the last year. Like I really hope that it just keeps increasing that way. And so maybe there will be a strong, or at least a growing union presence back home that you can support.
Sure. And I think that just to add to that, that's another part of our history, not just here in Harlan, but, across Appalachia, that whether folks consider themselves, conservative or more progressive, regardless of what party they're with, when you talk to people, that is something that the importance of unions and the real benefit that they've had and have facilitated for communities is something that a lot of people agree on. Just 4 years ago here in Harlan County, there was a major coal company that declared bankruptcy and wrote all of their employees bad checks and was, I think, trying to get a train with freshly mined coal out of their depot up in.
I think I remember this.
Yeah. It was Black Jewel Coal Company was the name of the company. And when a few of the now laid off miners saw that they were trying to abscond with what they had put their lives on the line to mine to provide for their families, they sat on the railroad tracks and didn't let it leave. The famous they had signs saying no pay, we stay, and things like that. So the spirit of collectively banding together to fight for our basic most fundamental rights to live a dignified life and to have dignified work is something that is almost like ubiquitous throughout Appalachia in one way or another, whether someone is a part of the union or not, whether they are conservative or more progressive. That instinct and that willingness to join with your neighbors and to really advocate for yourselves is so is such an undercurrent through this region. And it's one of the many reasons that I'm so proud to call this place home is that history and that willingness today to not be abused in that way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that at least through my perspective, politically speaking, class is the ultimate unifier. Like it unifies people across race, culture, language. Like that's how the unions got as much support as they did during the mine wars and the events of that era. Is like they united people from all different kinds of backgrounds and all different types of beliefs around the idea that nobody should struggle to keep a roof over their head. Nobody should be at risk of death on a job that they only kind of signed up for, like these basic ideas. And I think that is why, with class being the ultimate unifier, the people in power, like the political parties, but also the corporations and like all of this grouping work so hard to divide people like on whatever other basis they can so that they won't come together around class. Like, cause it's the same thing here in North Carolina with the right to work laws. Like I've done a few community listening surveys over the years, like community, organizing and rural community services has like always been my passion. And so I've started a couple of projects by just going door to door and being like, hey, what do you care about? What do you struggle with? And what are the solutions that you want to see? And more than once in those conversations, I have talked with, like in this one particular example, this guy was a mine worker. He was like pushing on what should be retirement age. He had worked at a mill worker, who was pushing like retirement age, had worked at the mill for like 30 years and had seen the right to work laws be implemented and like really executed in North Carolina, and was like, yeah, the union is like basically useless at this point because of the right to work laws. And he's like, I support the idea of a union, but under the current conditions, like, what are we going to do? And he just saw like how effectively things were being like broken up from that angle. And then, but this is someone who, politically speaking, I don't necessarily know where he landed, but was probably to the right of the current center. And then similarly, like I have family members who have voted for Trump, but who support the idea of unions, and who like we can jam and agree on like working class stuff and like basic human dignity, and honestly, like we'll take jabs at Biden together and laugh. But it's like, if we stick to our guns on like all of these other just like rogue issues that they keep us divided on, it's like we don't have the opportunity to have those conversations that reveal those shared interests.
Exactly. And, you know, that's something that, as you alluded to, has been employed by both sides of the aisle, because the old saying, we have two corporate parties, just one is pro-choice and one is pro-life. And that really is a good way to think about it, because both of the establishment leadership echelons of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are so dependent on needing there to be class differences so that their material well-being can be different from the people who are actually working to create their material well-being. Mm-hmm. And so the tactic of dividing working class people by, you know, different issues that, you know, are on their face important, you know, but that when we realize that we're all in the same boat in terms of socioeconomic status, then we start to think, okay, maybe it's not, maybe for the moment we can see past our differences on this issue, but, you know, work together with this group of folks and this group of folks to band together to better our material condition. And so that's just antithetical to the established order of things. And so that's why both parties are so keen on trying to tamp down this discussion of class and workers' rights and unions. And even while both of them kind of couch themselves in the language of being for working people in different ways. And that's another reason why I'm so fed up with the two-party system, is because in that way specifically, both sides are so disingenuous for the most part. There are definitely folks more so on the Democratic side, I'd say, than the Republican side, who really are concerned with the interests of working people nationally. But both of the corporate leadership, groups of the two major parties clothe themselves in this language of being for working people without actually doing things to better material well-being for working people. And it's just so frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And in a lot of ways, while undermining working people from multiple different directions. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. So this also gets touched on. I know I have been publishing a couple of excerpts from the What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia. And I think that this touches on really the entire history of our region has been used as essentially the chessboard for experiments to keep the working class divided over the last 3 centuries and to figure out what works the best here. Right. And even the birth of the slave codes, I did a whole episode on that. That was the birth of the slave codes came out of working people, slaves, indentured servants of different colors working together. And then people in power saying, oh shit, this is not going to be good for us. Right. How do we make this not happen? And then they're like, oh, well, what if we create punishments based on race to create an incentive that people will then have to not work together? Because the white folks are going to know that they're going to have a much worse punishment if they get caught escaping with the black folks and vice versa.
No, exactly. And I just listened to that first episode where you touched on Bacon's Rebellion. Is that it? Yeah. And it's like we've been saying from the get-go, the structure was put in place to facilitate class differences, but also to make sure that those in the ruling class and the elites didn't have to worry about the working class banding together to advocate for themselves. And that has been there from the beginning and is unfortunately apparent throughout U.S. history. When you look at just from the way that going back to the New Deal, for instance, I love the spirit behind it of a proactive of people with the ability in government to proactively better the material conditions of working people through different job programs and relief programs. But you have to contend with the fact also that so much of it was poisoned by segregation and a willingness to allow for difference, for a willingness to allow segregation to go on. For instance, FDR he was far too slow on civil rights, and his rationale behind that was that he needed the votes of Southern senators, many of whom were segregationists, to pass New Deal legislation. When you look at programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the camps which was just broadly dealt with ecological infrastructure and proper soil management, the camps where those workers would stay were segregated. You could talk for hours about redlining and how federal housing rules were designed to hamper home ownership among Black Americans. And so throughout history, just from that one instance you can tell, but throughout all of our history, really, it's been evident that the class divisions were intentionally, the class divisions have always been there, and the folks at the top have, in a lot of instances, used racial separation to stop working people from banding together regardless of their own race.
Yeah, it's so nefarious and so coordinated. And the propaganda that has pitched it as not coordinated has been really effective, because they have wiped out a lot of the evidence throughout history of the role that they have played in pulling the strings behind these things happening. I mean, even in the miners, when they were unionizing, they were not allowed to, part of the way that they prevented miners from unionizing was by keeping them racially separated. They weren't allowed to be fed their lunch at the same time in the cafeteria, just shit like that. And they also use a lot of legislation to use race as a way, basically to bring in a group of a certain race or immigrants to undermine unionizing or strike efforts in order to create this tension between racial groups, right? So that they would bring in African Americans from the South to undermine the efforts of unionizing workers that were white immigrants in the northern states. They would bring in immigrants from poor immigrants from Hungary to undermine the workers who were unionizing in the mine wars era. So much evidence that they just pit us against each other on purpose, but then they do everything that they can to wipe that out of the history books, so that they can't take the blame, but also so that we don't get any funny ideas.
Right, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Nancy Eisenberg wrote a great book about this called White Trash, the 400-year untold history of class in America.
You're the second person to bring this up, so now I clearly have to read this book.
Absolutely. It is. I couldn't put it down from the moment I started it. And it really does showcase, all of that. Like we've been talking about, the effort to establish and perpetuate class divisions in the U.S. while also using racial divisions to keep those class divisions from becoming more evident. So yeah, definitely read that. You would really like that book, I think.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out. And going back to kind of what you were saying about we were talking earlier about how the union numbers have been increasing in the last year, especially. I think for me, two really big things happened in 2020 at once. One of them was that the cracks in the capitalist shit show started to come through, and people were oh, this isn't working the way that it's been pitched to work. And then the second thing that happened, though, was that the people in power showed us also that there is an abundance, and that this idea of scarcity is just a myth, because they just started making up money when people needed money to survive. And like,
Exactly.
I have like a whole anti-capital like thing that I don't necessarily need to get into. But I think part of the reason that people are unionizing now is because they're like, oh shit, like they actually can give us more.
Right.
And like, they're just holding it from us. And so they're like a little bit more brave because they feel like there's more to be taken. And I think for a long time, they did a really good job at making us believe that there was nothing to fight for, essentially, right? Like there was no money that to even be had for us. Like if we got raises, then inflation would happen anyways, or whatever, you know? And now it's just kind of like crumbling in front of us and we have nothing left to lose.
No, I agree with you in a lot of respects on that. You know, like you said, when you know, they say that we don't have enough money to have universal health care, we don't have enough for universal pre-K, we don't have enough for you know, a higher minimum wage and inflation. Well, it's like you said, that is just, you know, bull for everybody who is seeing it, you know, the working people, because you know, we've had such inflation has been recently, but nobody raised the minimum wage. It's almost as if the concern is not a wage increase else. And you know, if we spent that, I forget how much it was that they estimated Medicare for all would cost each year, but you know, if we spent that, then who would the private healthcare lobbyists, what would they do for a living? You know, and you know, it's like you said, it's so evident that all of the old excuses that we've been given for why we can't have things like that, why we can't expand the social safety net, why we can't have things like universal basic income, those arguments are evidently been proven to be false from how much they spent on relief, like with the 500 billion for corporations in the first relief bill, and everything else has been, it's like you said, shown to just not hold any water. Those old arguments of why we can't do things better. And I'm glad to see that so many people are recognizing that, because, you know, it's the start of this new era in, you know, putting our foot down and saying, there's an old Woody Guthrie song, I ain't going to be treated this way no more, no more. And you know, that really is the sentiment that's going through so many people right now. And you know, when you could talk for hours about how during COVID so many people were being told, yeah, you have to still come to work even though you could get this deadly disease and we don't know if you would die or not, but you still have to come to work. And no, you don't have a union that can and people realizing that they didn't have a union that could bargain for them to say, no, we're not going to, you know, expose ourselves to this virus on the same working schedule that we had before the pandemic. So I'm glad to see that so many folks are realizing that there's a lot of opportunities out there for us to really advocate for ourselves in an effective way, in light of how we've seen that the system as it was in place before the pandemic was just on paper foundations, so to speak.
Exactly. And even in areas where like unionization hasn't necessarily been possible or been the fight that's been had, there's still been so much worker organizing that's been happening. I think about like the Bojangles out here in Western North Carolina, multiple Bojangles were conducting shutdowns and walkouts because of COVID policies, actually, and like lies that had been told by management about employees that had been sick and like exposed to other people, but then like trying to keep it hidden and stuff like that. And then same thing with McDonald's out here. Like folks are really recognizing that like, oh, I don't need work to survive. Work needs me to survive. And like,
exactly,
the truth is coming out.
Yeah. And along the same lines with, and this is something that I think is more, when you talk about taxation, for instance, how, you know, the biggest corporations pay almost nothing in income tax or a corporate tax, how the wealthiest individuals pay almost nothing in income tax, how there are so many loopholes that allow them to have their money in offshore accounts where they don't have to pay taxes on it. That's something that I think there's more that's been more evident for a longer amount of time, but is still so relating to that. Working people are realizing that we're the ones who give value to this company. And we're the ones who have made all of this wealth possible. Why is it that we effectively pay more in taxes than they do? And this is another area where you have corporate-backed Democrats, for instance, in the Senate, who are adamantly opposed to a tax hike, which I'm sure has nothing to do with the fact that they're probably being bankrolled by and getting contributions from, I should say, these very big corporations that would rather not corporate taxes be so high. And the duopoly and the corporate wing of, the corporate parties, the corporate wings of both parties have kind of framed the issue in a way that people have been seeing through for a long time. But I'm hoping that perhaps as more direct action is taken in terms of unionization, for instance, that more people will be demanding their elected officials to do something about the just grotesque income inequality that we have here. It's one of those things that has been stagnant for a long time, but hopefully as a more national class consciousness that I really think we're moving to, will help us to kind of work together to make a change in that respect too, and just to create a more fair and equitable and just system.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it will come from like part of what's the unions did that I think, like when folks call for like a general strike, for example, like they forget about this, is that like the unions also recreated new systems of support. So like they would like make it possible for folks to survive without work. So that like, and I think that in the process of this class consciousness building, I think people are going to naturally start creating new systems of collective survival, mutual aid, that kind of thing. And I think as a result, like the process of recreating will inherently be like, I think it'll force like somewhat of like crisis of power, honestly, where like the people in power are going to be like, oh shit, like they're becoming self-governing. We've either got to like replicate what they're doing so that we can claim ownership over it, or we've got to let them keep doing it and ultimately make ourselves null and void. Right. And so I think that like, that's part of this. What's awesome about this too, is that like folks will, I think, start putting more pressure on their representatives, but also they'll be creating new systems of being that will naturally kind of create a new sense of urgency and pressure too. Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely.
I know we're coming up on an hour. And I definitely want to have you back, and also like want to talk about anything else that you're still holding before we jump. Is there anything else that like you were hoping to touch on in our conversation?
This has been an excellent. I'm just so and just to really get to know one another and see for ourselves. I figured that there would be a lot of agreement between us on these issues, but for me it's great to meet you. For one, you're a great person, great to talk to, but also to know that there is a vibrant community of people in this region that are tired of the same old and are taking the proactive steps to make their voices heard, help other folks find their own voice, as you're doing through this podcast, and to shine a light on that has been suppressed by a lot of people who would rather that history not be as evident. Just to see the work that you're doing is so great, and I'm I know that you're going to continue to do great work for this place and the folks that call it home. And very thankful to be on the show, and I thank you for inviting me, and I'd love to be on again.
Yay. Oh my gosh. Yes. Definitely want to have you back. And likewise, like your energy is wonderful. And like the way that you are using, that you've created a platform that other Appalachians can have their stories told, and that we can lift up these pieces of our history that have really been intentionally stolen and covered up from us. And like, it's just so powerful. And I'm grateful that you're out there too. And I think a lot of times, community organizing is activism sometimes, but I think that other times community organizing is a much more like subtle art. And what it is it's really more of like weaving a blanket, and each like person contributes like a piece of the weave, right? Like a piece of the fabric, a piece of the thread.
Right.
And so like just being able to
Right.
connect with you and other Appalachians and seeing the connecting that you're making possible is just like, that's where the power is growing and like our fabric is getting
Right.
stronger. And so thank you so much
Absolutely.
for sharing your story today. And I think you're the first Kentuckian that I'll feature on the podcast, which is exciting. And actually, so before we wrap up, where can folks like support you? Where can they find your podcast? I'll put everything in the show notes, but just for the sake of shouting it out, where are all of the places that folks can support TJ and Appalachian Firesides?
Sure. So I guess the best thing to do would be to go to the social media pages at AppFiresides with 2 P's on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Twitter and Instagram will have a link tree in the main page profile where you can find all the places to listen to the podcast and have new episodes every Monday. And that would be the best way to reach the podcast and to listen in.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely send folks in that direction. Do you have like a Patreon or a crowd funding thing?
No, nothing like that. No.
Cool. Well, I think this episode is looking based on kind of like Ryan's calendar. I think this is looking at like the August 23rd-ish episode. That wraps up today's episode of Rednecks Rising. Thanks so much for listening, y'all. Thanks for all your support. Don't forget to follow TJ. Give his pod a listen. You'll find all his information in the show notes for today's episode. I appreciate y'all more than you know. And before we go, let's find out. What's the answer to today's trivia question, Chris?
So our trivia question today was, what is the closest distance that a coal mining company can mine from your home? You were a little bit off. Just a little bit. It's 300 feet.